When an 11-year-old boy arrived at Ridgewood Middle School with a quiet, anxious demeanor, the first words out of his mouth sent chills down the nurse's spine. What seemed like a simple introduction at first took a sinister turn as the pieces unraveled, revealing a dark truth, one that put him and those who cared about him in unimaginable danger. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Freddie was seated on the small cot in the nurse's office, his knees pulled up tight against his chest. The nurse, Mrs. Halliday, had just asked him a routine question about how he was feeling, but the way he whispered his response, so quiet that she had to lean in to hear, immediately prickled the back of her neck with unease. His words were barely more than a breath, yet they contained a fear far beyond his 11 years. His eyes darted around the room, as if expecting a menacing figure to jump out from behind the medical cabinets. That single expression told Mrs. Halliday that something was very wrong. She had witnessed shy students, anxious students, even traumatized students, but Freddie's trembling posture had a particular urgency to it, and it weighed on her heart. Outside, the bright midday sun streamed through the narrow windows of Ridgewood Middle School's well-worn corridors. Despite the light, there was a somber hush in the nurse's office. Mrs. Halliday gently guided Freddie to hold still so she could check the bruises on his forearm, purplish blotches shaped like someone's grip. He flinched at her touch, eyes squeezing shut for an instant, as though bracing for a blow. She apologized softly, telling him she had no intention of hurting him. She hoped to coax an explanation from him, but Freddie only shook his head, refusing to look up. She knew immediately she needed to call in someone else for help. Word of the boy's anxious demeanor soon reached Mr. Stringer, a literature teacher known for his empathetic approach toward his students. That afternoon, he found Freddie sitting alone on a bench near the cafeteria. "Why don't you join the others?" Mr. Stringer asked gently. Freddie just glanced at the crowd of lively kids swirling past, as though they were from a completely different universe, one he couldn't begin to inhabit. He lifted his shoulders in a near imperceptible shrug, then looked away. Mr. Stringer noticed the faded bruises lining the boy's arm, half concealed by the sleeve of his hoodie. He recalled Mrs. Halliday's urgent whisper about the suspicious marks. "Freddie," he said, crouching beside the bench, "is there anything you want to talk about? Maybe we can figure something out together." Freddie shook his head, gaze fixed on the ground. "I'm fine," he muttered. His tone wasn't defiant but rather steeped in the dread that if he said too much, something terrible would happen. Mr. Stringer recognized that kind of fear. He had once worked with a student who'd been neglected by his caregivers, and there was a familiar guardedness about Freddie, like he was watching every word, every gesture, as if it might betray him. Mr. Stringer did not push. He simply sat there, quietly stating, "If you need me, I'm here." The boy nodded without raising his eyes. Mr. Stringer observed Freddie's trembling hands before leaving him to his lunch break. The teacher's heart clenched. He knew this wouldn't be the end of it. That evening, Mr. Stringer stayed late in the staff lounge, discussing Freddie's situation with Ms. Porter, another teacher who had also noticed the boy's odd behavior in her math class. She described how he refused to work in groups, how he constantly checked the clock, and how he sometimes startled if someone approached him too quickly. "He looks so tired," she said, tapping a pen against her notepad. "It's like he barely sleeps at night. He told me he wants to stay in the classroom during recess, said he just doesn't like the noise outside. That's not completely unusual. Some kids prefer quiet, but with the bruises." Mr. Stringer nodded, remembering the dark circles under Freddie's eyes. "He's not the type to joke around. If the nurse is concerned, I'm concerned. Maybe it's something at home, or maybe—" He trailed off, not wanting to jump to conclusions. He had a feeling that if they pressed too hard, Freddie might retreat even further. Mr. Langley, the school janitor, passed by the lounge and overheard their lowered voices. He paused in the doorway, arms full of cleaning supplies. "You two talking about that new boy?" he asked. "Freddie?" His graying eyebrows pinched together. He's been hanging around the halls long after classes end. Last night, I almost had to chase him out." Ms. Porter sat up straighter. "You saw him here late? Did he say what he was doing?" Mr. Langley nodded. "He said he was waiting for someone to pick him up, but it was well past dusk. He begged me not to make him go home. Broke my heart, the way he said it. Swore he'd be quiet if I'd just let him stay in a classroom. I didn't know what to do. Eventually, a man and a woman came for him, said they were his foster parents. They weren't rude to me or anything, but I don't know. Something about them didn't sit right." A chill passed through Mr. Stringer. "He begged you not to make him go home?" he repeated quietly. "That's very concerning." All three shared a worried look. They knew, as educators and staff, that they had a duty to keep an eye on situations like these. But duty aside, they genuinely cared about Freddie. Over the next few days, each tried in their own subtle way to connect with him. Ms. Porter asking if he needed help with his math assignments, Mr. Stringer inviting him to stay after class to talk about an essay, Mr. Langley offering small acts of kindness by handing him an apple or a carton of milk. Yet every time they approached, Freddie's panic seemed to spike. He withdrew into himself as if behind an invisible wall. The days gave way to an overcast week. Thick gray clouds loomed over Ridgewood Middle School, matching the sense of heaviness that followed Freddie. He rarely spoke beyond monosyllables, refusing to explain his bruises or why he was so hesitant to head home when the bell rang. Eventually, Ms. Porter and Mr. Stringer arranged a meeting with Ms. Dalton, a compassionate social worker known for her gentle but thorough approach in matters of suspected abuse. "She's the best," Ms. Porter told Mr. Stringer, riffling through a folder of student records. "If anyone can get Freddie to trust an adult enough to talk, it's her." Ms. Dalton arrived at the school on a brisk Thursday morning, wearing a calm, reassuring smile. She met Freddie in a small conference room next to the principal's office. The blinds were drawn, creating a serene environment that contrasted with the hustle outside. Ms. Dalton introduced herself softly. "I'm here to listen, Freddie. That's all." He nodded, eyes downcast. She asked him about his favorite subjects, what he liked to do for fun, if he had any close friends yet. He answered in quiet, hesitant tones. She did not press him about the bruises right away. She allowed him to speak at his own pace, made small talk about favorite books or TV shows. After a while, Freddie's shoulders loosened, just barely. He still appeared watchful, but a fraction of that overwhelming tension had receded. Ms. Dalton eventually asked, "How are things at home? You're living with your foster parents, right?" Freddie swallowed. "Marcus and Elaine," he said flatly. "I live with them." She tilted her head in a caring gesture. "And how do you feel about them? Are they kind to you?" Freddie's lips pressed into a thin line. "They're okay," he managed. His gaze shifted to the door, as if desperate to escape. "It's fine." She waited a moment, the silence as gentle as possible, giving him space to expand or correct himself. When he said nothing else, she nodded. "If there's ever anything you need to share, I'm here. No matter what it is. Understand?" He blinked, nodding again without making further eye contact. Ms. Dalton sensed the fear that radiated from him, so palpable it weighed down the air between them. She knew better than to force a disclosure on a child so guarded. The meeting ended with Ms. Dalton reminding him that she was only a phone call away, day or night. Freddie offered a faint "thank you," still clearly fearful. Afterward, Ms. Dalton joined Mr. Stringer and Ms. Porter in the principal's office for a brief discussion. She closed the door behind her, rubbing her brow. "He's frightened," she said, looking troubled. "Something is definitely happening at home, but he's not ready to talk about it. I'll arrange a home visit. I want to meet these foster parents of his." Principal Rhodes, a tall woman with a commanding but warm presence, glanced across the desk. "We have to handle this carefully. If there's a sign of immediate danger, we can't delay. But we have procedures." She looked at Ms. Dalton, who nodded. They all understood these protocols were crucial, but in the face of a scared child, the system sometimes felt unbearably slow. A few evenings later, Ms. Dalton paid that home visit. The Turner residence was a neat, modest house on a quiet street. Marcus Turner answered the door with a polite smile, inviting Ms. Dalton inside. Elaine Turner appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, offering tea as if they were hosting an old friend. The living room was immaculate, no clutter, no sign of struggle. Freddie sat on the couch in clean clothes that covered his arms and legs entirely, his expression carefully blank. Ms. Dalton found the atmosphere unnervingly staged. She made small talk, commending the Turners on their well-decorated home, all while observing Freddie from the corner of her eye. He was fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "So Freddie's teachers say he's quite bright, though he seems a bit withdrawn," Ms. Dalton remarked carefully. "Have you noticed anything like that at home? Maybe anxiety or moodiness?" Marcus Turner's polite smile held firm. "He's a bit shy sometimes, but we chalk that up to his past experiences. We're doing our best to help him open up." He turned to Freddie, who avoided his gaze. "Isn't that right, Freddie?" Freddie's voice came out in a near whisper. "Yes." Elaine set down a cup of tea with steady hands. "We're trying to give him structure and guidance. It can be tough, but we manage. We want nothing but the best for him." Their answers seemed calculated, their manners so precise that Ms. Dalton found herself uneasy. She felt an undercurrent of tension, too subtle to be pinned on a single phrase or gesture. Yet it was there, simmering beneath the pleasant facade. She asked whether Freddie had any complaints or concerns, and once again, he shook his head. "I'm fine," he said, echoing the same words he used with everyone at school. After about half an hour, Ms. Dalton stood to leave, mind churning with questions she couldn't yet confirm. She felt no direct evidence of wrongdoing, Freddie made no accusations, and the Turners didn't slip up in their outward kindness. Yet Ms. Dalton's instinct screamed that the boy was afraid for a reason. She told Marcus and Elaine that she might follow up in a couple of weeks, just to see how Freddie was settling in. They nodded, wearing the same polite masks. As Ms. Dalton stepped onto the porch, she heard the door close behind her, and she couldn't shake the image of Freddie's stricken eyes. The faint fear within those eyes, even when the Turners were putting on a show of warmth, told her this household was not as cozy as it appeared. She resolved to keep a closer watch, uncertain but determined. Back at Ridgewood Middle School, the staff continued to quietly observe Freddie. More weeks passed, each day a mirror of the last. He rarely spoke unless required, kept his head down, and flinched if someone patted his shoulder. Then new bruises appeared. One day, Ms. Porter found him in class with a bruise peeking from beneath his collar, shaped suspiciously like someone's hand. When she asked him about it, he simply said he had tripped. But that same day, Mr. Langley spotted more marks on Freddie's wrist when the boy reached up to close his locker. The janitor approached gently. "Freddie," he said, "are you okay?" Freddie froze, stammering that he was fine, that he just needed to get home quickly. Mr. Langley offered him a ride if he needed it, but Freddie refused. I have to go," he mumbled, brushing past him and disappearing down the hall. That was the day Ms. Dalton received an urgent call from Miss Porter, who outlined her growing alarm about Freddie's condition. She told Ms. Dalton about the suspicious bruises that never seemed to heal properly, or that seemed to appear in new places each week. Ms. Dalton decided it was time to step up the inquiry with Child Protective Services. A formal investigation into the Turners' home life began, albeit quietly, so as not to alert Marcus and Elaine too soon. Meanwhile, Freddie remained stoic, insisting nothing was wrong whenever asked. It was a Friday afternoon, well after the final bell, that Mr. Langley discovered Freddie hiding in a corner of the supply closet near the cafeteria. The boy had curled himself into a tight ball, whispering repeatedly, "I can't go home. I can't." When the janitor gently asked him why, Freddie just whimpered, "I'm scared." Mr. Langley helped him up, guiding him to a bench in the deserted hallway. With the sunlight fading through the windows, the corridors fell into a peaceful hush. "Freddie," Mr. Langley said in a hushed tone, "tell me what's going on. Maybe we can help." Trembling, Freddie pressed his lips together. After a moment, He took a shaky breath and looked around, as if checking for watchers. "They'll be mad if I tell," he whispered. "They always get mad." "Who?" "Marcus and Elaine," Freddie muttered, tears threatening to escape. "If I say anything, they'll hurt me." Alarm raced through Mr. Langley. He placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Freddie, they won't. There are people who can protect you. Teachers, social workers, the authorities. They can help." Freddie pulled away, eyes wild with fear. "No, you don't understand," he gasped. "They told me if I talk, they'll make it worse. I don't want to go back there. Please, let me stay at school tonight." His voice cracked, raw and desperate. It broke Mr. Langley's heart to see a child so terrified. He didn't know the legal ramifications of letting a student sleep at school, but he was certain it was out of the question. Instead, he hurried to fetch Miss Porter and Mr. Stringer, who arrived moments later. They, too, were horrified to see Freddie in such a state. Miss Porter crouched before him. "Freddie," she said softly, "we're going to help you, but we need to tell Miss Dalton. She can make sure you stay somewhere safe tonight. Would that be okay?" Freddie swallowed hard, tears brimming in his eyes. He gave the slightest nod. Then, almost immediately, he looked over his shoulder in panic, as if expecting the Turners to materialize and drag him away. Miss Porter assured him that they would handle everything discreetly. She phoned Miss Dalton, who arrived at the school an hour later, along with a representative from Child Protective Services. After hearing Freddie's terrified pleas, they decided it was in his best interest to remove him from the Turners' home on a temporary basis, pending a thorough investigation. Freddie was placed in a local shelter for children awaiting foster placements. It seemed like a victory, a life saved from immediate danger. However, the system was not as simple as one might hope. Freddie quickly realized that the shelter, while safe from the Turners, felt bleak and impersonal. He had no friends there, no anchor to cling to. He feared being shuffled from one foster home to another, never knowing if the next place would be any better than the last. That fear built inside him day by day. One cold morning, Ms. Dalton arrived at the shelter to speak with him, but the bed was empty. A frantic search ensued. Freddie had run away during the night, leaving behind only a small note for Ms. Dalton. "I'm sorry. I can't do this. Don't try to find me." The note was stained with drops that looked suspiciously like tears. Panic ignited among the staff at Ridgewood Middle School. Mr. Stringer and Ms. Porter joined Ms. Dalton in driving around the city, searching the parks, bus stations, and any other spot where a scared boy might hide. For nearly 2 days, there was no sign of him. At last, late in the evening, Mr. Stringer found Freddie sleeping on a patch of flattened cardboard behind an old convenience store. The boy was curled up in a thin jacket, shivering in the cold. Mr. Stringer knelt beside him, gently shaking him awake. "Freddie," he whispered, voice tight with relief. "You're safe now. Please come with me." Bleary-eyed and exhausted, Freddie looked up, terror flickering until he recognized Mr. Stringer's face. He didn't resist when the teacher helped him stand. "I'm sorry," Freddie rasped, trembling partly from the cold, partly from fear. I can't keep bouncing around. I don't trust anyone." Mr. Stringer put an arm around the boy's shoulders, leading him away from that desolate alley. "I understand you're scared," he said softly. "But you can't stay out here. You'll freeze. Let's figure this out together, okay?" Freddie gave a weak nod. He was too tired and hungry to fight any further. Mr. Stringer contacted Ms. Dalton, who told him that Freddie would have to return to the shelter for now. Yet, looking down at the boy's sunken cheeks and tear-streaked face, Mr. Stringer made a choice. "What if I became a foster parent?" he asked, half to Ms. Dalton on the phone, half to himself. "I can provide him stability." Ms. Dalton paused on the other end of the line, clearly surprised. "You need to go through some steps, but we can expedite it if that's truly what you want," she replied, her voice gentle but cautious. "It's not a simple commitment." "I realize that," Mr. Stringer said, glancing at Freddie's haunted eyes. "But he needs someone he trusts. He knows me, At least a little. Freddie, overhearing, stared up at Mr. Stringer. The teacher offered a small, supportive smile. "I promise, I'm not going to harm you," he said. "We'll do everything the right way." Over the next week, Ms. Dalton managed the paperwork and home assessments. She checked Mr. Stringer's background, visited his modest apartment, and spoke with him at length about the responsibilities involved in fostering a child, especially one as traumatized as Freddie. Through it all, Mr. Stringer remained steady in his resolve. He had no illusions that it would be easy, but the alternative, letting Freddie flounder alone in a system he had come to dread, was unacceptable to him. At last, Child Protective Services approved Mr. Stringer as a temporary foster parent. Freddie moved in, carrying only a small duffel bag from the shelter. When he first stepped into Mr. Stringer's apartment, he stood in the hallway, as though waiting for permission to venture further. "You can look around," Mr. Stringer said, trying to sound casual, though his heart pounded. "It's not very big, but there's a couch, a small TV, and you'll have your own room. Make yourself at home." Freddie entered cautiously, peeking into the cozy living area with a bookshelf overflowing with novels and a comfortable armchair by the window. A faint smile tugged at his lips when he noticed a small potted plant perched on the windowsill, its leaves leaning toward the sunlight. "Thank you," he said softly, setting down his bag. That night, Mr. Stringer made a simple dinner of pasta and salad. Freddie ate in silence, but Mr. Stringer could see his shoulders slowly unwinding. After dinner, he gave Freddie a spare set of towels and showed him how to work the shower. When the boy emerged clean and dressed in fresh pajamas, he looked years younger, soft hair still damp, face finally free of dirt and tears. Mr. Stringer felt a pang of sympathy. No child should have to worry about basic safety in his own home. Yet Freddie still carried an undercurrent of anxiety, like a cornered animal that never truly let its guard down. For the first few nights, he slept fitfully, waking from nightmares that left him gasping in the dark. Mr. Stringer would knock gently on the bedroom door, entering only when invited, to reassure Freddie that everything was all right. He offered warm milk, sat with him until he drifted off again, sometimes even reading quietly from a nearby chair. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against the Turners began in earnest. Ms. Dalton and Child Protective Services filed a case to terminate the Turners' foster care license, citing evidence of abuse. However, a major hurdle was Freddie himself. He was the key witness, and without his testimony, the Turners could argue that the bruises were accidents and that the staff at Ridgewood Middle School had overreacted. The case quickly became mired in complications. Marcus and Elaine Turner hired an attorney who specialized in defending families against child welfare claims. They painted Freddie as a troubled, manipulative boy who concocted wild stories to avoid discipline. "He's got a history in the foster system," they claimed. "He's had outbursts before. These bruises could be from fights with other kids, or from his own clumsiness. There's no solid evidence that we caused them. You can't convict good foster parents on hearsay alone." Freddie, hearing about the Turners' accusations, grew more withdrawn. Mr. Stringer tried to comfort him at home, urging him to speak the truth in court, but Freddie often froze when confronted with the possibility of testifying. "I'm too scared," he whispered one night, hunched on the couch. "They'll find a way to twist everything I say. Or they'll find me if they get out of trouble." Mr. Stringer knelt in front of the couch, looking Freddie in the eye. "They won't," he said firmly. "We're here to protect you. Ms. Dalton is here. Ms. Porter, Mr. Langley, everyone at the school is on your side. We have to stand up for what's right." Freddie stared at him, tears welling but not falling. He wanted to believe it, yet fear loomed like a shadow. The court hearings began to escalate. The Turners' attorney presented a polished portrait of them, philanthropic, loving, devoted to helping at-risk kids. They displayed pictures of their well-kept home, even praising Freddie's academic achievements as a result of their supportive environment. The judge, an older woman named Judge Morales, listened attentively. She had seen countless cases of potential child abuse, but she also knew some had proven false, fueled by misunderstandings or vendettas. Proof was essential. Ms. Dalton and the school staff testified about the bruises, Freddie's fearful behavior, and the night he begged not to go home. However, without Freddie's direct confirmation, the Turners' lawyer suggested that the boy simply had an overactive imagination, that he might have been influenced by certain teachers or by the unfriendly environment of the shelter. Slowly, the tides of the case seemed to shift. People started whispering that the Turners might walk away with just a slap on the wrist, or even reclaim custody of Freddie. As the tension mounted, Mr. Stringer and Ms. Porter pressed harder, speaking to Ms. Dalton about alternative ways to help Freddie feel safe enough to testify. They sought counsel from child psychologists, who advised creating a supportive setting in which Freddie could speak without facing the Turners directly. The system, however, had its procedures, and Judge Morales insisted that a face-to-face statement would be most credible in her court. Week after week, Freddie lived in a state of heightened anxiety. He attended classes but couldn't concentrate. At night, he dreamt of returning to the Turner home, or worse, being torn away from Mr. Stringer and forced into a new, unknown place. He woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding. Mr. Stringer did his best to reassure him, but the looming court dates sapped Freddie's courage. Finally, the day came when Freddie was scheduled to speak in court. He arrived trembling, ushered into the courtroom by Ms. Dalton. Ms. Porter and Mr. Stringer sat behind them, offering moral support. On the other side of the aisle, Marcus and Elaine Turner sat with their lawyer, calm and collected. Freddie looked at them only once, then averted his eyes, his breath coming fast. The judge asked him some routine questions, his full name, age, and relation to the Turners. He mumbled answers, voice cracking. Then the critical question came. "Freddie, can you tell us about your experiences living with Marcus and Elaine Turner?" Freddie swallowed. His gaze slipped from the judge's face down to his sneakers. His mouth opened, then closed. Seconds ticked by in the silent courtroom. Ms. Dalton placed a supportive hand on his shoulder, but that only made him tremble more. Finally, he shook his head, voice faltering. I can't," he said. Judge Morales frowned. "Freddie, you must answer." Tears pooled in the boy's eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, words breaking. "I can't." With that, his testimony ground to a halt. The defense attorney wasted no time highlighting Freddie's refusal as indicative of confusion or manipulation. "He's an impressionable child, Your Honor. It's clear he's conflicted, possibly influenced by well-meaning but overly zealous teachers. There is no proof of abuse here." Marcus and Elaine sat rigidly, their eyes fixed on the table in front of them, but inwardly they seemed assured. After the hearing ended, Mr. Stringer wrapped an arm around Freddie, guiding him quickly from the courtroom. Freddie sobbed quietly, torn between relief that he didn't have to accuse them openly, and guilt that he had failed to speak. Ms. Dalton said in a low tone, "It's not over yet, but we need something more concrete. Evidence. Or a testimony that can hold up under scrutiny." In the days that followed, everything felt bleak. Rumors circulated that the Turners would regain the right to foster Freddie, that the removal had been based on overblown allegations. Even the mention of that outcome made Freddie cling to Mr. Stringer's sleeve in terror. Ms. Porter tried to remind him that the legal process took time and that the Turners had not yet won, but it seemed too close for comfort. While the case lingered, the tension weighed on every aspect of Freddie's life. He dreaded going to school, convinced that each passing day brought him closer to being forced back to the Turners. He shrank further into himself, rarely speaking, eating very little. Mr. Stringer took him to a child psychologist, who gently encouraged him to practice ways of expressing his fears without feeling overwhelmed. The sessions helped a bit, but the upcoming final hearing loomed like a thundercloud on the horizon, overshadowing every improvement. A few afternoons before the decisive court date, Ms. Dalton called a meeting with Mr. Stringer, Ms. Porter, and even Mr. Langley, who had been a key witness to Freddie's pleas for help. They sat in a conference room at the school. Ms. Dalton spread some papers across the table. "We need to present a strong front," she said firmly. "I've got statements from all of you and a few other staff members. There's photographic evidence of bruises, though the Turners' lawyer has managed to argue that they were inconclusive. What I'm missing is a direct statement from Freddie, naming them as his abusers. Mr. Stringer's jaw clenched. He's terrified, he said. He believes they'll retaliate if he speaks out in public. Ms. Porter nodded in agreement. If he's forced to see their faces while accusing them, I doubt he'll manage it. Is there any possibility we can do a testimony by video, or behind a screen? Ms. Dalton sighed. I've tried. The judge believes an in-person testimony carries more weight. She's worried about setting a precedent for behind-the-screen testimonies outside of certain extreme circumstances. She wants to gauge Freddie's demeanor herself. The frustration was palpable. They all knew that justice shouldn't hinge on a traumatized child's ability to speak in front of his abusers, but that was the stark reality they faced. The meeting ended with no definitive solution. Yet a sense of grim determination knitted them together. They wouldn't give up. The final court date arrived. Mr. Stringer, Ms. Porter, and Mr. Langley filled up one side of the gallery, while the Turners sat on the other, immaculate as ever. Ms. Dalton had briefed Freddie that morning, trying to reassure him that the judge was a fair woman who genuinely wanted to protect him if the abuse was real. Freddie sat on a wooden bench in the hallway, wringing his hands. Every so often, he wiped his sweaty palms on his pants and glanced up at the clock, his eyes unfocused and distant. As the session opened, the Turners' attorney reiterated their stance. Well-meaning, law-abiding foster parents, burdened with a child who had unresolved trauma, and had misinterpreted strict discipline for abuse. They attacked the credibility of the school staff, suggesting they had overstepped their boundaries by diagnosing injuries they weren't qualified to interpret. By the time the defense finished its statements, Freddie's side looked to be standing on shaky ground. The judge cleared her throat. Before I come to a decision, I want to hear from Freddie directly, she said, her voice echoing across the polished wood of the courtroom. Freddie, please come forward. A hush fell. Freddie stood, knees quivering, guided by Ms. Dalton up to the witness stand. He was asked to state his name, which he did, voice trembling. The judge then leaned forward slightly. Freddie, this is the last chance to clarify what happened in that home. I want you to speak freely. No one here will harm you for telling the truth. Freddie swallowed, eyes flicking to where Marcus and Elaine Turner sat. They stared back with expressions that seemed calm, but he recognized the coldness beneath. He opened his mouth, and for a moment nothing came out. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, They hurt me. Silence descended so completely that one might have heard a pin drop. Freddie's heart hammered in his chest. He felt Ms. Dalton's presence behind him like a supportive shield. He forced himself to look at the judge again, tears slipping down his cheeks. His voice steadied, despite the quake in his body. They hurt me, he repeated louder this time. Marcus. Elaine. They pinched and squeezed and sometimes slapped. If I didn't do what they said He paused to breathe. They locked me in the closet. Marcus Turner lurched, about to speak, but his attorney pulled him down by the sleeve. The judge raised a hand for silence. Freddie could almost feel the searing glares from the defendants, but he kept going. He described the times he had tried to fight back, only to be punished more severely. He confessed that he had worn long sleeves not because of the weather, but because he was told to hide the bruises. Tears welled in Miss Porter's eyes as she listened. Mr. Stringer gripped the edge of the bench so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Mr. Langley stared at Freddie in admiration, proud of the boy for summoning the courage. Ms. Dalton pressed a hand to her chest, relieved beyond words. When Freddie finished speaking, the judge asked a few clarifying questions. Each time, Freddie answered, voice trembling but resolute. In those moments, the entire narrative changed. With Freddie's words, the photographic evidence, and the teacher's observations no longer stood alone. The truth was out, and it was devastating to hear from the boy's own mouth. The defense attorney tried to cross-examine him, but each question seemed to crumble under the weight of Freddie's raw testimony. Instead of shining a light on any falsehood, the scrutiny only emphasized how terrified he had been all along. By the end of the session, it was clear the judge had seen enough. Judge Morales ordered a short recess, and then returned with her ruling. Marcus and Elaine Turner were found guilty of child abuse and neglect. She condemned them for their manipulative conduct, for the emotional and physical harm inflicted on a vulnerable child. She declared that Freddie would remain out of their custody permanently. Ms. Dalton exhaled a sigh of relief, tears shining in her eyes. Freddie's shoulders sagged with release, as if a giant weight had lifted. That evening, Freddie returned with Mr. Stringer to the apartment, still somewhat in shock. Even though the Turners had been found guilty, the boy's eyes darted around anxiously, as though expecting a nightmare to manifest from the shadows. Mr. Stringer placed a comforting hand on his arm. "They can't hurt you anymore," he said softly. "They'll never be allowed to take you back." Freddie nodded, but the fear lingered. He had spent too much time haunted by those nights in the Turner household. He needed reassurance that the safety he felt now was real. Mr. Stringer decided to skip any celebrations or outings. Instead, they had a quiet night in, eating takeout and watching an old animated movie. Freddie tried to smile at the funny parts, though his laughter was fragile. Within a couple of days, Ms. Dalton made arrangements for Freddie to stay permanently with Mr. Stringer until they could sort out the next steps. Adoption was a possibility, though the legal process could be lengthy. For the moment, they were content that Freddie was protected. Ms. Porter, Mr. Langley, and Ms. Dalton dropped by the apartment over the next week to check on him, bringing everything from board games to homemade meals. Freddie looked thinner than usual, but the persistent fear in his eyes was finally receding. However, just when the air of relief had begun to settle, a new terror struck. 2.5 weeks after the Turners' conviction, Mr. Stringer awoke in the dead of night to the sound of shattered glass. He bolted upright, heart pounding. Before he could reach Freddie's room, a pair of dark figures burst through the hallway. It was Marcus and Elaine Turner, somehow out on bail for the pending sentencing hearing, or possibly having fled legal custody. Adrenaline flooded Mr. Stringer's system as he tried to block them, but Marcus shoved him aside, sending him sprawling against the table. Elaine, face twisted in desperation, rushed toward Freddie's door. Mr. Stringer struggled to get up, but Marcus pinned him. From the bedroom, Freddie's frantic scream echoed. "Mr. Stringer!" he cried. The teacher struggled fiercely, calling out for the boy to lock himself in a closet or crawl out the window. The apartment was small, though, and the Turners knew every angle to exploit fear. Hearing the commotion, Ms. Dalton, who had a practice of checking in by phone, couldn't help from inside her own apartment, but she was set to call the authorities the moment she sensed something off. Mr. Stringer had no way of reaching a phone. He was pinned, grappling with Marcus, who hissed under his breath, "If you think you can take our kid away, you're wrong." Freddie was dragged out of his room, trying in vain to break free. "Stop, please!" he shouted, tears streaming down his face. Elaine's grip was iron. Marcus stared at Mr. Stringer with something like hatred. "You think you're the hero?" he sneered. "We're taking Freddie back, and there's nothing you can do." Mr. Stringer struggled, managing to land an elbow to Marcus's ribs. Marcus staggered, giving Mr. Stringer a split-second advantage to scramble to his feet. But Elaine had already bolted with Freddie into the hallway. Marcus blocked Mr. Stringer's pursuit, and by the time Mr. Stringer shoved past, the kidnappers had vanished into the stairwell. By the time he made it outside, all he saw were taillights speeding away. An unthinkable dread settled over Mr. Stringer. He rushed back inside, grabbed his phone, and dialed Ms. Dalton, who immediately alerted the local police. Within minutes, the authorities were on the scene, combing the apartment for clues. The kidnappers' exact whereabouts were unknown. The Turners had effectively vanished with Freddie. Panic spread through the community. Ms. Porter wept when she heard the news, blaming herself for not insisting on more security measures. Mr. Langley was furious, vowing to do anything he could to help track them down. Days passed with no trace of Freddie or the Turners. State authorities took the matter seriously, working in coordination with federal agents. They interviewed neighbors, reviewed camera footage from nearby intersections, and put out alerts in surrounding states. Mr. Stringer hardly ate or slept. He was consumed by the terror of imagining Freddie in the hands of the very people who had tormented him before. On the fourth day of the kidnapping, a breakthrough came. A tip led authorities to a remote cabin several hours away, just across the state line. The place was secluded in the woods, the kind of location that offered cover to those seeking to hide from prying eyes. A team of law enforcement officers was dispatched, determined to bring Freddie back. Mr. Stringer desperately wanted to go along, but Ms. Dalton insisted he stay behind for his own safety. The tension was near unbearable. No firearms or mention of them was needed here. The authorities had other means of apprehending the suspects. They surrounded the area quietly, closing in with radio communication. Freddie was found inside, kept in a locked back room, trembling and malnourished but alive. Marcus attempted to use Freddie as leverage in a final act of desperation, threatening physical harm if the authorities came any closer. But in a swift, strategic move, one of the agents managed to breach the door and tackle Marcus, knocking him unconscious before he could hurt Freddie further. Elaine was cornered in the living area, where she surrendered. Both Turners were quickly restrained, arrested on the spot, and placed into custody with no possibility of further bail. Freddie was carried out by one of the officers, pale and shaking. The officer gently handed him to a paramedic who guided him into an ambulance to check for any injuries. The boy's eyes darted about, glassy and haunted. He asked in a shaking voice, "Where's Mr. Stringer?" The paramedic assured him that Mr. Stringer was safe, waiting back in the city, anxious for his return. In the aftermath, it was confirmed that the Turners would face severe charges, including kidnapping, child endangerment, and violating a court order. Their guilt was irrefutable, and they were immediately imprisoned without the possibility of release before sentencing. By the time Freddie finally returned to Mr. Stringer's apartment, he was physically exhausted and emotionally frayed. He clung to Mr. Stringer the moment he saw him, burying his face in the teacher's jacket. Mr. Stringer held him close, tears burning at the corners of his eyes. "Thank goodness you're home," he whispered. "You're safe now, I promise." Over the next few weeks, Freddie struggled with nightmares, reliving the kidnapping in vivid detail. Therapy sessions were scheduled more frequently, and Ms. Dalton visited often to provide additional emotional support. Ms. Porter and Mr. Langley dropped by after school hours, offering hot meals, moral support, or a simple presence that reassured Freddie he had people on his side. The boy's progress was slow but noticeable. He started to open up more in therapy, recounting the terror of those 4 days, how he had feared he might never see Ridgewood Middle School or Mr. Stringer again. 1 month after the kidnapping, the sentencing hearing for the Turners took place, but Freddie didn't have to attend in person. His statement from the trial was more than sufficient, combined with the overwhelming new evidence of their crimes. Marcus and Elaine Turner were sentenced to a long prison term, ensuring they wouldn't threaten Freddie, or any other child, ever again. The final step in Freddie's journey toward healing came with Mr. Stringer's decision to formally adopt him. Freddie felt a swirl of emotions about it: hope, gratitude, and a ghostly fear that it was too good to be true. But the adoption process moved forward, supported by Ms. Dalton's glowing recommendation and the backing of everyone at Ridgewood Middle School. By the time the paperwork was signed, Freddie had gradually begun to trust that he was truly, finally free of the Turners' grasp. That evening, Freddie and Mr. Stringer shared a quiet dinner at the small wooden table in the apartment. The adoption had gone through earlier that day, and Mr. Stringer had teased Freddie about having to get used to calling him Dad, but only if Freddie wanted to. Freddie blushed and smiled, poking at his plate of spaghetti. He wasn't quite ready to say the word, but the bond between them was clear. In his own time, he would embrace the new reality of having a father figure who genuinely cared for him. Between bites, Mr. Stringer said softly, "You've been through more than any child should. I hope you know how proud I am of you. You stood up for yourself in court, despite all your fears. You survived the worst." He paused, looking across the table at Freddie, whose eyes shone with gratitude and vulnerability. "You're strong, Freddie. And you have a lot of people who love you." Freddie swallowed a lump in his throat. "I never thought this could happen," he said, voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you, for everything." They finished their meal in companionable silence, the weight of everything that had happened settling like a gentle hush around them. Outside, the city lights glowed in the dusk. Inside, for the first time in what felt like ages, Freddie felt safe. No nightmares lurked in every shadow, no heavy footsteps approached to drag him away. Instead, there was only the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the warmth of a real home, and the promise of a future freed from fear. Over the following weeks, Freddie started to smile more. Sometimes they would sit on the couch in the evenings, reading from Mr. Stringer's impressive collection of literature, or playing board games that Ms. Porter had brought over. Freddie began to trust the process of normal life, to recognize that not every adult meant him harm. Though the emotional scars lingered, each day chipped away at the fortress of fear that had surrounded him for so long. Mr. Langley occasionally visited on weekends, offering help around the apartment, or taking Freddie out for a walk around the neighborhood, pointing out interesting trees or local landmarks. Freddie listened, enthralled, discovering that the janitor who once roamed the school halls with a mop had a wealth of knowledge about local history and horticulture. It was a gentle reminder that allies came in many forms. Ms. Dalton, satisfied that Freddie was safe and stable, still checked in to see how he was adjusting. She marveled at the changes in him: more direct eye contact, less trembling, more willingness to speak about his feelings. Therapy continued, of course, because recovering from trauma was never an overnight process. But for the first time, Freddie walked into those sessions with hope rather than dread. At school, Ms. Porter noticed a difference in her math class. Freddie still sat near the back, but he occasionally raised his hand. He helped a classmate with a difficult problem once, surprising her with his kindness. At lunchtime, he sometimes lingered at the table with classmates instead of rushing off to hide in the corners of the cafeteria. And though he remained soft-spoken, the teachers rejoiced at every little sign of social growth. The final echoes of the Turner saga drifted away into the city's memory as the pair sat down for dinner each evening. Freddie would ask Mr. Stringer about his day, or about the next assignment in literature class. Sometimes they would discuss the future, what high school might be like, what sports or clubs Freddie might join, or the possibility of traveling during school breaks. Each casual conversation felt like a triumph, a world away from the terror-laden hush of just a few months before. On the 1-month anniversary of the rescue, Mr. Stringer quietly acknowledged the date over dinner. They had spaghetti and garlic bread again, reminiscent of that night soon after Freddie had testified in court, but now the mood was much lighter. Freddie was wearing one of Mr. Stringer's old t-shirts, far too big for him, and he joked that he looked like a walking tent. Mr. Stringer smirked. "We'll get you a new wardrobe soon," he promised. Freddie twirled his fork in the spaghetti, then set it down. "I'm really glad you found me," he said, voice catching only slightly. "I know things were dark, and I was so scared. But you didn't give up on me." Mr. Stringer reached across the table, ruffling Freddie's hair affectionately. "Never," he said. "I promised I'd be here for you, and I meant it." Freddie's eyes shone, a shy smile forming. "Thanks," he whispered, and that single word was laden with more gratitude than any speech could hold. Outside, the city lights glittered, and inside that modest apartment, the boy once terrified of going home finally felt the warm glow of belonging. Though his journey of healing would continue, and though the memory of past horrors might never fully vanish, he was no longer alone. Surrounded by supportive teachers, a caring social worker, and a new father who had risked everything to protect him, Freddie felt what it was like to have a safe place, a real home. Even as the night wore on, he drifted to sleep with the soft murmurs of traffic below, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow held the promise of a fresh start. And as Mr. Stringer turned off the living room lamp and checked on Freddie one last time, he breathed a silent prayer of gratitude that the boy who had once walked into Ridgewood Middle School with nothing but bruises and fear now drifted off under a roof where love, understanding, and hope finally prevailed. Thanks for listening to the story. If you made it this far, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell. Best wishes to all of you. I'll see you in the next one.